He was born in the shadows of a dying empire, a sickly child in a world that worshipped strength. Joseph Goebbels entered life on October 29, 1897, in a small industrial town called Reit, near Dusseldorf. The Germany he opened his eyes to was rigid, pious, and obsessed with order. His father was a devout Catholic postal clerk, his mother a quiet woman who believed in sacrifice and salvation. They prayed for a humble life, but their son, he prayed for greatness. And when greatness did not come, he decided to invent it. Goebbels grew up with a club foot, a deformity that made him limp for the rest of his life. To him, that limp was not just a physical defect, it was a curse, a lifelong reminder that nature itself had denied him the one thing he craved most: admiration. As other boys ran, he read. As they fought, he imagined. While they mocked him, he built within himself a weapon more dangerous than any muscle: resentment. Resentment that would later disguise itself as ideology.
He was intelligent, painfully so. He devoured books, studied philosophy and literature, fascinated by the power of words to create entire worlds. He idolized the romantic poets, men who had turned suffering into beauty. In his diary, young Goebbels once wrote that he wanted to become a poet of the soul. But what he would eventually become was something far darker: a poet of destruction. The First World War came like a storm that shattered all illusions. Goebbels was too frail to fight. Rejected by the army he longed to join. For the rest of his life, that rejection haunted him. He would later write, "My foot was my fate." The war ended with Germany defeated, humiliated, starving. For millions of young men, this humiliation was an open wound. But for Goebbels, it was something else, an opportunity. He realized that wounded pride is the easiest emotion to control. By the early 1920s, he had finished his PhD in literature, writing a dissertation on the 18th century novelist Wilhelm von Schütz, obscure, symbolic, and utterly irrelevant to the chaos consuming Germany. He was unemployed, frustrated, drifting, the intellectual with a limp, the dreamer with no audience. And then, in 1923, he discovered the man who would change his life: Adolf Hitler. At first, Goebbels was skeptical. He saw Hitler as a crude demagogue, a loud man with a dangerous dream. But something about him, the rhythm, the confidence, the fire, seduced Goebbels' imagination. In his diary, he described his first encounter with Hitler's words as the revelation of a truth I had always known, but never dared to say. What he found in Hitler was not just a leader, but a mirror, another failed artist, another man humiliated by life, another man who turned rejection into rage. When he finally joined the Nazi Party in 1924, Goebbels was not yet the cold strategist history remembers. He was still a writer searching for meaning, a man torn between Catholic guilt and Nietzschean pride. His early diaries are full of contradictions, mystical fantasies about purity, desperate confessions of inferiority, and flashes of brilliance that reveal his understanding of human emotion. He wrote, "The people don't want truth. They want faith. They want to believe in something larger than themselves." That sentence, written years before the Nazis seized power, contains the seed of all his future propaganda. He began his political life as a regional agitator in the Ruhr, where the working class was drowning in poverty and despair. Goebbels learned quickly that hatred sells faster than hope. He experimented with rhetoric like a chemist with poison. mixing just enough truth to make the lies digestible. He discovered the value of repetition, of rhythm, of making words sound like destiny. He saw how the human mind could be lulled into belief not by logic, but by emotion. By 1926, he had caught Hitler's attention. Hitler saw in Goebbels what he saw in no one else, a man who could give his ideas a soul. That same year, Goebbels was appointed Gauleiter of Berlin, tasked with transforming the city, then a bastion of leftist culture, into a stage for National Socialism. And there, in the theatres and cafes of Berlin, Joseph Goebbels began rehearsing his greatest performance, the transformation of lies into collective truth. He started with speeches, sharp, emotional, theatrical. He used silence as a weapon, sarcasm as a knife. He mocked the intellectuals, romanticized the workers, and painted Jews, Marxists, and liberals as enemies of a single mystical Germany. He was not simply persuading people, he was seducing them. His oratory had the cadence of music, the rhythm of myth. People left his rallies trembling, not because they had understood his words, but because they had felt them. Goebbels understood something that few politicians ever do. People don't think in arguments, they think in images. So he replaced ideas with imagery, symbols, gestures, slogans. Every movement, every phrase was rehearsed, calculated to evoke instinct rather than reflection. The swastika, the salute, the torchlight parades, they weren't decorations. They were psychological architecture, designed to make the individual feel insignificant and the crowd divine. In private, however, his insecurities never left him. He envied Hitler's magnetism, his presence, his messianic aura. In his diary, Goebbels once confessed, "He is the prophet. I am merely his instrument." That mixture of devotion and jealousy became the engine of his life. He built his identity around Hitler's approval, his morality around Hitler's will. The transformation was complete. The failed poet had become the priest of propaganda. But what makes this transformation chilling is how conscious it was. Goebbels was not delusional. He was deliberate. He studied the masses like a scientist studies disease, measuring, testing, refining. He knew that fear and pride were two sides of the same coin. He once told his staff, "You must always appeal to the gut, not the brain. The brain resists. The gut obeys." By the time the Nazis took power in 1933, Goebbels had turned manipulation into a science. He controlled every radio, every newspaper, every theatre, every film. He didn't just censor, he redefined what truth meant. "It is not propaganda's task to discover truth," he declared, "but to serve the state." The state, of course, was Hitler, and the truth became whatever Hitler needed it to be. Yet behind the polished speeches and orchestrated parades, there was still that small, limping man, the boy who never forgave the world for his weakness. He smiled on balconies while cities burned because in his mind, he was finally winning the war. He had been fighting since childhood, the war against insignificance. He took power in 1933, not as a conqueror with armies at his back, but as a voice whose echo would grow until it filled every home. Once Hitler became Chancellor, Goebbels was appointed Reich Minister of Public Enlightenment and Propaganda, given control over what Germans read, heard, saw. The radio, the newspapers, the films, the stage, the art, all were tools, clay in his hands to mould opinion. from books burned in public squares, so-called un-German works banned, writers exiled or silenced, to the boyhood buildings of culture repurposed into propaganda machines. Every thread of German culture was rewoven under his direction. In those early speeches, on March 15th and 25th, 1933, Goebbels told the press and radio directors that the ministry would no longer leave the people to their own devices. He insisted a people's government must shape what people believe is real. The message must come not from a dozen voices, but from one source, unified. He believed that propaganda is not a sideshow in politics, but its very foundation, something he would later articulate in many guises. He selected symbolic enemies, Jews, communists, traitors to the folk, and fashioned them into the villains of a moral myth. These figures were not merely political opponents. They were distractions, scapegoats, metaphors turned flesh. He simplified the world. Germany is purity. Enemies are impurity. This simplification made it possible for slogans to replace arguments, for fear to replace doubt. He understood that repetition is more powerful than novelty when one wants to build belief. He used radio broadcasts, newspapers, films, posters. Same ideas, slightly different forms, repeated until resistance weakened. In one famous speech in Berlin's Sportpalast in February 1943, facing the disaster of Stalingrad and increasing losses, he did not lie about the facts entirely, but reframed them. Loss becomes sacrifice. Disaster becomes test of character. Audiences, already primed by years of propaganda, accepted his framing. Hope and despair danced on the same stage, but under his choreography. He deployed emotional frames. You are betrayed. You are under siege. You are strong, yet you must sacrifice. Through images, crowds, banners, architecture, through rituals, rallies, public ceremonies, marches, songs, he made politics into performance. In every performance, he played the role of the father figure, the cultural guardian, the man who would lead Germany out of shame and defeat. He harnessed symbols, metaphors, mythic history, Prussia, old Germanic glory, to feed identity, zeal. The folk was not just people, it was sacred. And behind all this, he constantly watched what worked. He measured public opinion where possible, even in a regime built on control. He tested slogans, evaluated reactions, conducted media campaigns whose outputs were not only rhetoric, but social weather. What made people fear? What gave them pride? What made them speak? What made them stay silent? He turned emotional intelligence into statecraft. He made persuasion into power. In the silence between speeches, in the dim light of candle or lamp, Goebbels wrote, from 1923 until nearly the end, diaries, letters, reflections. In these writings, one hears the voice of insecurity, envy, longing, for image, for approval, for immortality. He writes of illness, of humiliation, of wanting recognition from those who look down on him, intellectuals, critics, his own body. He writes of pride too, his speeches, his accomplishments, his growing mastery. But pride always walks beside pain. He once wrote, "Propaganda has only one object, to conquer the masses. Every means that furthers this aim is good. Every means that hinders it is bad." That line is not casual. It reveals the cost he was willing to pay. Truth sacrificed, morality twisted, mechanism elevated. His entries show envy toward those physically unmarked, socially admired. His own body he saw as failing, his limp, his deformed foot, the perception that he was not handsome or strong, but he transformed that deficiency into fuel. If he could not be admired for his body, he could be admired for the power of his words. He crafted a voice, a presence that few could ignore. He writes of audience devotion, that women touched him at rallies, that crowds laid their hands on him, begging for blessings. The people show such touching devotion. Sometimes I have the impression that they are almost in a religious trance. That observation reveals something both disturbing and illuminating. His understanding that mass emotion can border on religious worship. And he liked that closeness. He needed it. At the same time, private doubt. Will they, when things are worse, still believe? Will my speeches still convince? Am I performing in vain? Yet he almost never allows despair to settle. He reframes. He repositions. He repurposes. Loss becomes mission. Trauma becomes resolve. In the diaries, one sees him plan not only what to say, but how to be seen. What images, what architecture, what light, what costume. He debates with himself. Should I project strength, even if I feel weak? Should I show compassion, or let them fear? Private wounds become blueprint. The self becomes instrument, and he frets over legacy. How will history remember him? Will he be villain, genius, poet, manipulator? Will his name survive as myth? He believed that in surviving as myth, he would survive as power. For him, immortality lay in influence, not humility. Words are not harmless. Goebbels knew that. He knew that once belief is widespread, once identity and duty fuse, fear and hate cease being ideas. They become actions. Under the Nazi regime, the propaganda he orchestrated laid the foundations for persecution, systemic discrimination, legal exclusion, Kristallnacht, deportations, ultimately genocide. The rhetorical depiction of Jews as enemies of the people, as parasites, as underminers of morality, made what came next imaginable. It made atrocity possible. He did not need to falsify everything. Often he admitted setbacks, military losses, suffering, hardship, but he reframed them into moral narratives. Yes, Stalingrad was a disaster, but out of disaster, our character is tested. He pointed to past glories to hide present failures. He promised secret weapons, miraculous interventions, divine destiny. In doing so, he kept belief alive, even when defeat loomed. He also depended on complicity, not only from the enthralled, but from the meek, from bureaucrats, from ordinary people. When every newspaper says the same thing, when every radio station transmits approved messages, when entertainment is filtered, film censored, art muzzled, when books are banned, education altered, resistance becomes harder, dissent more dangerous, silence more likely. Goebbels' propaganda did not just occupy space, it suffocated alternatives. It taught people not only what to believe, but what not even to imagine. There is too an insidious progression. First, the exclusion of difference. Books burned, voices banned, symbols removed. Then the moral dehumanization of people, stereotyping, lies, mockery. Then persecution, a legal framework to codify discrimination. Finally, mass murder. Propaganda didn't do the killing, but it built the stage on which killing could appear not just plausible, but necessary. It made cruelty seem rational, duty, ideological, even noble. There is that famous photograph, Geneva, 1933, Goebbels smiling, well-dressed, confident. It is both incongruous and revealing, because a smile is not a confession, it is performance. That public face of charm and culture was part of his work. He smiled so that people might believe he was civilized, benevolent, trustworthy, even while he was orchestrating exclusions, burning books, preparing war. Charm and cruelty can walk together. Goebbels cultivated kindness to some, disdain for others, intellectual interests and aesthetic sensibilities, while suppressing dissent and propagating hate. The mask of culture allowed brutal ideas to seem refined. As the war dragged on, as the bombs fell, as Russian armies advanced, Goebbels kept speaking, not retreating to defeat, inventing miracles, calling for total war. In February 1943, he addressed the Berlin Sportpalast. The news from the fronts were grim. The Soviet advance loomed, defeat at Stalingrad. Yet he stood in that hall, framed by gods of stagecraft, and asked the people, "Do you want total war?" And he forced them to answer. It was not a question, it was a ritual. And in that ritual, the people answered willingly. Goebbels became more than minister. He became voice, myth, mask. He became the conductor of fear and faith. He chose loyalty over escape. In the Führerbunker, after Hitler's suicide, on April 30th, 1945, Goebbels and Magda poisoned their 6 children and then themselves. In that final act, he did not betray ideology. He embraced it utterly. Death as ultimate spectacle, final performance of belief, rather than life without the myth. Study Joseph Goebbels not to monstrosize him as anomaly, but to understand how he was possible, and how parts of his method are not foreign now. Simplification, repeated slogans, emotional framing, enemy construction, spectacle. These are tools still used everywhere in advertising, politics, media. The difference is consent, awareness, resistance. We must ask, when we hear messages repeated, when outrage is packaged, when fear is stoked, when identity is defined by what we despise rather than what we aspire to, are we listening or are we being guided? History does not only teach what happened, it teaches what may happen again. The likes of Goebbels show how power can arise, not just from armies, but from whispered lies turned into shared belief, from hands raised in salutes, from songs sung in crowds, from voices speaking in homes. If someday you wonder how a people believed in evil, remember, the architecture of persuasion is tangible. Watch the symbols, scrutinize the narratives, question the performance. Because the greatest weapon is not force, it is belief. And once belief takes hold, the stage is set, and those who master it may smile while the world burns.